Now, the last section of the lecture focuses on two very important questions. Now that you know the differences between economic systems, and we've talked about the three different main types, planned economy, free market economy, and a mixed economy, or things that are normally also known as capitalism, communism, and something in between, socialism. Now that we know those differences, the question is, how do you know which one is the best or better than the others? Simply knowing in your heart is not good enough. You gotta provide some form of empirical evidence, and so the question becomes, how do you numerically measure success of one system or one country over the other? You will have two take-home assignments based on these questions. The first one after this lecture will be to prove numerically, empirically, that the United States is doing better than other countries. And so you will basically have to present a number of measures for measuring the success of the United States versus other countries, as well as give me the answers as to where the United States is on each of those measures. The next take-home assignment will be looking at basically you will have to provide arguments for keeping the United States a capitalist country versus becoming more socialist. And again, rather than talk about ideological touchy-feely things, you would actually have to base your arguments around the notions of, well, if we do this, this is what's going to happen in terms of outcomes. And if we go the, for example, socialist way, this is what's going to happen in terms of economic numeric outcomes. And again, you will have to back up your projections with specific numbers and specific measures. So let's review different types of measures that you can use for either of those take-home assignments. One, well, obviously you can measure wealth. You can argue that a successful nation is a wealthy nation. Now the question is, how do you measure wealth? What is wealth? And so there are a number of indicators that you can use to measure wealth at the country level. Well, one obviously would be the GDP of the nation, right? But because the nations differ drastically in terms of size, GDP by itself doesn't tell you much. A small Luxembourg has a much smaller GDP than, for example, large Congo. But obviously, Luxembourg is better off, wealthier than Congo, even though the overall size of the two is not in favor of Luxembourg. So what we use is the GDP per capita indicator. So GDP per person, so how much wealth the country produces per person living in the country. You have a very interesting article in your optional readings posted on the Blackboard that talks about the problems with GDP per capita. Many people use this as not only the best indicator of economic development, but as the only indicator of economic development. But unfortunately, GDP per capita doesn't really tell you as much as we'd like it to tell you. The same applies, by the way, to GNP per capita, which is different from GDP per capita in the sense that GDP, that's all the product made within the country per person living in the country. GNP, that's all the product made by the country's people and companies all around the world. So if there is an American company making money or products in, for example, China, it would be counted in GNP, but not in GDP. So the biggest problem with GDP per capita is that one, it doesn't account for example, shade economy. So many transactions may not be accounted for if they are not accounted for. So every time I pay you without a receipt, that's not part of GDP, so it's not part of the calculation. And so in some countries where much of the transactions are made under the table, it's still economy, it's still services and goods being made and offered, exchanged between the people, but it wouldn't be included in the official figures. Equally so, when you, for example, have a little piece of land in your backyard, you may be producing a lot of goods there, food, for example, but again, it wouldn't be accounted in GDP per capita, even though, again, it may be a substantial addition. Another big difference is that GDP per capita expresses wealth in dollars, and it may sound like $1 here is the same as $1 there, but in reality it's not. Different prices make a whole lot of difference. $100 can buy much less in the United States than it can buy, for example, in Czech Republic or in China. And so if someone's if you see two countries with the same GDP per capita, it doesn't necessarily mean that the people in those two countries are equally wealthy in terms of what they can afford and what they have and how good quality of their lives is. Um, Cost of living matters a lot in these cases and may need to be taken into account. One of the reasons for that is most of the economists these days use not the GDP per capita, but GDP per capita at so-called purchasing power parity. What that tells you is that that's basically wealth per person adjusted for the cost of living. So person power parity takes into account the prices in the two different countries and basically adjusts for $100 being worth more here than, for example, they are elsewhere, or vice versa. Another problem, and this is a huge problem with the GDP per capita measure, is that any product made in the country is considered wealth. But you can probably imagine that, let's say, making guns or spending money on public safety services, even though that's actually a product, it's something that the society produces. It's not exactly the type of product that necessarily means good life. If you could imagine one country that produces only food and pleasure items, for example, and the total cost of all those products is, let's say, $1 billion, and another country that produces weapons to defend safety of the public for $500 million, and then food and pleasure items for another $500 million, even though the GDP per capita in both countries would be $1 billion, or $1 billion total, not per capita. You can imagine that one country is definitely much better off than the other country, because one country has to spend half of all its product on just making us safe, whereas in the other country that part does not have to be covered by extra spendings. Now, another way to look at it is to take a specific example from real life. And let me talk about my grandfather. My grandfather was born pre-Soviet Union era, lived all his life in the Soviet Union era, and then he died a few years ago at the time when the Soviet Union collapsed. He lived in a country that is not rich by the GDP per capita standards. So the GDP per capita, depending on which year you look, but it was somewhere around $2,000 to $3,000, maybe four in the better years, as opposed to, for example, $30,000 to $40,000 in the United States. So when you look at a person like my grandfather here, and at a person of comparable age and everything else in the United States, it may look like the American guy is 10 times as wealthy. At the same time, I'm telling you, I lived in both countries. That was not the case. My grandfather, just like his American counterpart, had a sizable house, 3 bedrooms. He had some land, about about 0.8 acres, if you convert it to acres. He would have some means of transportation. He would have some savings. He would be able to go on vacation from time to time. So he didn't definitely look much poorer than his American counterpart. So he may definitely not be as rich, but at the same time the ratio wouldn't be really 1 to 10. So why we may be under that impression when we look at the GDP per capita in the United States and in that country where my grandfather lived? Well, let's look what's not accounted in GDP. So as I said, my grandfather had, well, it's actually about 2 acres of land, so it's about 1 acre on his house, and then he had a little bit more specifically for gardening a little further away. He usually had at any time 2 cows, about 3 pigs, 25 domestic birds. So as a result, he never had to buy any vegetables, any fruits, any eggs. In fact, when we, his grandchildren and children, would visit him, he would always have a basket of food for us. And so that's something that he grew himself in his garden, his backyard. And so that would be at least a saving of about $1,500 a year, maybe even more. Plus, in many cases, he would have some surplus of food, especially in the fall when there are lots of fruits and vegetables, and he would sell it for another $500. So that's roughly $2,000 right there added to his GDP per capita that is not accounted in GDP per capita. Another thing is my grandfather was a carpenter, so he was making just about anything, from tables to chairs, all that kind of stuff. Most of that, again, was not really paid for officially. I mean, a neighbor in a village just comes and says, I need a chair, and my grandfather makes it for him. The guy just pays cash or maybe returns some other form of service. Like for example, in the fall time, well, we'll help you dig potatoes if you make us a chair. And again, that's creation of goods, creation of services, but it's not accounted in the GDP. Interestingly, when my grandfather died, pretty much the whole village gathered to, for the funeral. And when I say village, I really mean like a little town. You understand? It's not a village like in the Amazon River Delta village. It's more like a small town here somewhere in rural North Carolina. And so we had about 300-400 people who came for the funeral, and so we obviously didn't have enough chairs for everyone. And so my grandmother asked me to go around and ask people for chairs so that we have enough seats for all the guests. And as I was going door to door, amazingly, every time somebody would give me a chair or two, would say something like this: "Did you know that your grandfather actually made that chair?" Well, that was at the time. I mean, he lived in the time in the Soviet Union when there were no Home Depots, there were no Lowe's, and so most of the furniture, especially in smaller towns, would be made by local carpenters. And so in the town where my grandfather lived, he was the carpenter. So just about every carpentry piece in that village, from, as I said, just about anything made out of food, was made by him over all those years. Now, another thing is that we are talking here about seasonal neighbor workers, what I would call. So normally the approach was such that in the spring, when it's time to plant potatoes, for example, several neighbors gather together and then they plant potatoes for one neighbor and then for another one, and so on and so on. And then in the fall they do the same thing and kind of same relay. So they dig potatoes at one piece of land and then move on to the next one, to the next one, and so on and so on. That's also creation of services. I mean, just like here, if somebody comes and, I don't know, cuts my trees in my backyard, or maybe helps me paint my house, here it would be counted as GDP because that's service provided. In Ukraine, exactly the same services would be provided the same way, but I mean, those people are not sole proprietors or have companies. That's all unaccounted for. And again, that's at least, I'm guessing, another $500 per year not accounted in GDP. Many services, foods, clothes, and all that stuff are also basically, sold under the table in a sense. So I had a company in Ukraine for quite a number of years, and I'd say that probably 80% of all the transactions that we made were not accounted for. I had a car dealership and a repair shop, and so with cars, selling them, it was a little more difficult without receipts. But repairing them, come on, I mean, most of the time, in fact, when I was repairing my cars, if I needed to, I always tried to pay cash too, because I know if I pay cash, that cash goes pretty much directly into the pocket of the mechanic, and he would be more interested in, doing a good job on my car. And again, most of that wouldn't be accounted for, and that's a lot of money, a lot of services and goods created, but not accounted in the GDP. And then obviously help from relatives and friends, all that kind of stuff, which is much more common in so-called developing countries. So even though the official GDP per capita might have been around $3.5 thousand, the real GDP per capita, if you take into account all these little things, would be more like $8,000. And so given that the cost of living was much lower too, the lower prices, if you adjust for basically purchasing power parity, the GDP per capita at purchasing power parity in the former Soviet Union at that time might have well been about $12,000. So now when you compare that to about 30,000 in the United States, it's still a huge difference, but it's not definitely 10-to-1 ratio. So it just shows you that, yes, people in that country were poorer, substantially poorer, but not like this, more like this, right? So keep that in mind when you talk about GDP per capita or GDP per capita at purchasing power parity. Now, talking about PPP again, here we have a list of countries and their GDP per capita in US dollars, as well as GDP per capita at PPP. The base is the United States, so for the United States it's the same. But then when you look at other countries, you see interesting things here. Like for example, when you look at Switzerland, Switzerland has a higher GDP per capita than the United States does. And it may create an impression that Switzerland is a richer country than the United States. But Switzerland is extremely expensive. I have been to Switzerland a number of times, and I must tell you, it's a very, very expensive country, from gas to food to hotels to anything. So when you adjust for that difference in cost of living, you actually see that Switzerland is not necessarily a poorer country than the United States, but they actually can afford fewer goods and services with the money that they make. So adjusted their GDP per capita at purchasing power parity is actually lower than that of the United States. So in a sense, the United States effectively gives you more wealth and more goods and services. Then you look, for example, at Czech Republic, and so that country is very cheap in terms of cost of living. And so the GDP per capita is only about 1/4 of what it is in the United States, but it's almost double that when you adjust for the low cost of living. So all of a sudden it goes up to almost $20,000. So whereas initially it might have looked like the people in Czech Republic are 1/4 as rich as Americans are, in reality it's actually only about 1/2. So keep that in mind, and by the way, I'm giving you a hint, there will be a question on the exam based on this table. And here is that question for you just to preview. It will not appear on the exam in exactly the same form, but you need to understand that PPP notion and will be able to comprehend it on the exam. So for this question, think about cost of living in GDP per capita is higher than GDP per capita at PPP, so think Switzerland for this question. And obviously the answer is, it is a cost of living in the United States. Now, obviously, wealth as money made by the people or produced by the people is not the only measure of economic success. If you had a country where, let's say, one person makes all the wealth and everybody else just does nothing absolutely, the average per capita wealth may be not that bad, but obviously it wouldn't be a good country. It wouldn't be a country where you want to live, well, unless you're that one rich individual. So one of the measures might be then economic equality. You want wealth to be distributed more or less equally, so you don't want to have drastically poor people. I guess you don't mind drastically rich people, but again, you want them to be more or less in the middle class areas. So if that's what you want, then you might want to measure what we call income distribution inequality, or Gini as it is sometimes called, after the Italian economist who came up with the concept. When you look at this map, you can see Gini distribution around the world. And so when you look at the United States, it's actually not very egalitarian country. So the United States is right in the middle, meaning that it has a sizable portion of very poor and very rich people, though still a sizable middle class. Countries like, for example, some African countries here or some Asian countries or Latin American countries are on the extreme where there is drastic disparity between the rich and the poor. And if you remember that graph that I showed you with the wealth distribution, that's that bimodal distribution that looks like a camel with two humps. So they have a huge difference between the rich and the poor and virtually no middle class. And again, that's probably not what you want. So even though, for example, GDP per capita in Brazil may not be that bad, that low, but when you look at the distribution and realize that most of the wealth is in the hands of one small group of people and everybody else is rich, is poor, well, you realize that it's probably not such a good system. On the other hand, when you look at the more socialist Europe or Canada or particularly Japan, their distribution is very narrow. So there are no poor people, really no poor people. Maybe there are really not no filthy rich people. So everybody is roughly equally rich. And so again, many people believe that that's the optimal approach. So that yes, there is difference. Some people make substantially more than others, but there are no extremes. There are no super poor people, as well as perhaps not so many super rich people. If you take that as a measure of economic development, if your goal is to make everybody well off, then, well, Gini might be one of your measures and one of the indicators of economic development of a nation. Talking about the United States, what worries many economists is not even that the United States is not very equalitarian country. It's not even not that. What worries them is the rapid increase in income inequality. Here you have a change over the last 50-60 years, and you can see that the United States went from a country with a fairly large middle class and smaller poor and rich classes to something that is much more divided, so to something that is much more very rich and very poor. And if this tendency continues, there is a very good chance eventually the United States may end up like, for example, Latin American countries, Brazil or Argentina, where there will be a small group of people who own most of the wealth, and then the rest of the people who are very poor. and that's definitely not what we want. We may be okay with some discrepancies in wealth and some people being richer than others, but we don't want a huge gap there. Now let me give you an experiment that illustrates very well how we sometimes think about those issues in terms of ideological stereotypes as opposed to clear, good thinking. There was a very interesting study published in Bloomberg's Business Week some time ago, and I actually have that paper, a summary, two-page summary of that paper in your optional readings. A group of Americans, and by a group I mean a huge sample of thousands of people from different states, were asked if they are okay with distribution inequality. And most Americans say, yeah, that's fine. Yeah, we are fine with having rich people and poor people. We don't want to be like those socialists where everybody's equal. We're fine with that. And then the economists, and I believe it was a team of economists from New York University and from Duke, they conducted a very interesting experiment. They asked people first, what do you think the distribution of wealth is in the United States? And then they asked people, what do you think the distribution of wealth in the United States should be? And the way they measured that, they asked, how much wealth do you think the top 20% should own? And so when people were asked those questions, first, they greatly underestimated how much wealth the top 20% in the United States have. So most of the people thought that it was not as bad as it really is. So the actual distribution of wealth is that top 20% of Americans own about 84% of wealth. So the richest 20% of the country own 84% of all the wealth in the country. Respondents, those thousands of people asked by The Economist, thought that the top 20% owned about 55 up to 60% of wealth. So they first underestimated that number greatly, so they didn't know how bad the problem was. But then when all those thousands of Americans were asked, what do you think the ideal distribution would be? The average was 25-30. So meaning that if Americans got their way, at least the respondents who participated in the survey, about, 40,000 of them, they said that we think the ideal distribution would be if top 20% own about 30% of the country's wealth. Now the funny thing is that this is pretty much what Europe has, so the socialist Europe has. And so when those respondents were asked if they would prefer to have the European system, most of them said, oh no, we don't want to be socialists. But again, that's when you frame it from, is your system is better than somebody else's in the ideological terms. But once you get down to actual numbers, it seems like many people would actually prefer their system as opposed to the system that is here. And again, here I'm not saying that their system is better. In fact, if it was better, I would probably stay there. So the reason I came here is because I probably like the system better. The point here is that, again, just like in many other issues or areas of life, in particular in international business, in many cases people make those decisions without clear numeric analysis. They just make those decisions purely on, as I said, ideology-based arguments, stereotypes I would even say. And so that's what I kind of fear or have problem with. I'm fine if somebody analyzed the problem, looked at the numbers, look at the historic perspectives and said, this is what I like. I'm fine with that, whatever that this is what I like is. What worries me if the people say, this is what I like, this is what I'm going to vote for, without ever getting into the actual issue, without actually analyzing the topic, and so making a decision that is not very well informed. So that's the danger of where I see the problem. Some economists also say that we shouldn't be looking at money at all. I mean, Bobby, it's not the money that I like, it's what the money buys. Remember that quote from one of the movies? So some economists say that we shouldn't be looking at the actual wealth. We should be looking at the actual outcomes of wealth. So instead of looking, for example, at how much money we make, we should be looking at what exactly do we buy or what exactly we can buy. And there is this one indicator that takes that into account. So there is what we call Human Development Index. And that one looks at basically, human development, how good off humans are, well off humans are in a particular country. So they look at things like, for example, life expectancy. Presumably, if people live longer, that's a better country. Working hours. If you have to work your butt off and work 70, 80 hours a week, yes, you may be making a lot, but will your life be better because of that? Education, attainment, literacy, all those kinds of, things that make human life better. And so when you look at those, you would see that the best countries or countries that have the highest human development index are countries in Northern Europe, Canada, surprisingly, to New Zealand. So those countries, they have fairly wealthy, good life, and so what they can do with their wealth is actually quite amazing. So they have access to education, to culture, they live long, they don't die as infants, so they have reasonably short working hours, long vacations, so they can actually enjoy life much more than people in other countries. And so interestingly, when you look at the United States, it's definitely still on top of the list. I mean, 0.95 on a 0 to 1 point scale, the United States is definitely quite up. But at the same time, it's not doing as well as some European countries, particularly Northern European countries, or even Canada. And so the question kind of is, well, what do you want to spend your money on? And once you have that list, it actually seems like Americans make a lot of money, but they end up working too much for it, being under too much stress, and eventually not having a very productive, enjoyable life. And again, I guess this is a little exaggeration because the United States is still on top of the list. It's just not as high as a few other countries that we sometimes perceive as poorer. But the United States is definitely above average in terms of HDI, Human Development Index. Some people say that maybe we shouldn't even look at what you can buy. Maybe we should just go directly and measure happiness. If you have a tribe living somewhere in Africa and the people are very happy, they may have not a t-shirt to put on. Maybe they even run barefoot and naked all day long. But if they're very happy in that lifestyle, who are we to tell them that their life is not very good and our life is better because we have bigger cars, bigger houses, and all that stuff? They can say, well, are you happier than I am? And if the happiness is the ultimate outcome of our life, then perhaps countries with the economies that give that happiness are the better countries or better societies. And so some economists say that maybe we should just measure happiness and see how happy people are. Personally, I'm not sure if that's the best way to measure overall success of a nation, but then at the same time, I definitely see some logic, some grain of truth in that statement. I mean, you can be the wealthiest of all, you can have all those goodies, but if it doesn't make you happy, is that really what you want? So here is your question number 5, and this one again may appear on the exam in some form. Take a minute and try to answer it. And yes, the answer is unfortunately none of them by itself is a very good measure. So you have to look at a larger picture because each of these measures has a different. Now, the big question is, so what? We know the differences, so what? How does it matter? Well, I have here a whole list of advice for how you as a manager can thrive under each of these conditions. I'm not going to read this, you can read it at your leisure, but yes, look through this list, there are lots of interesting ideas there. And finally, for each lecture, the last slide will be, this is what you need to know on the exam. So I promise you there will be nothing on the exam that is not covered in this final slide. And as you will be preparing for the exam, just make sure that you know those definitions, those understandings. And if there is something in the book chapter that will not be covered on the exam, I will actually have a list